Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 84th episode of the IWFM Navigating Turbulent Times webinar series. You're joining us today in our second part of our digital twin journey series. Our first part was in September, and that really focused on the what, how, and why. And today you're going to hear some real practical and discussions and polls, without a spoiler alert, around how you actually implement digital twins. So it's still linking to establishing the single source of truth. So if we go on to the next slide, just to introduce who's joining me on today's webinar. Many of you would know me already from previous episodes, as well as the first part of this particular series. I'm Peter Brogan, Head of Research and Insight at IWFM. Today, my role is slightly different. I'm doing the intro and close today's proceedings. We have got Mike Packham as host, but I'll introduce Mike later. So you can see the lovely pictures of our panelists and host on today's episode. And I just want to remind, before I get each panelist to introduce themselves, today's webinar is being recorded, so it is live as I'm demonstrating now. And we do have some polls, so there's some interactivity. We'd like you to get join in today's debate. We're trying to make this as interactive as possible as the technology allows. So first of all, I like to do introductions to each panelist. And first up, I will go from left to right on the screen. Kwam Adewale, Industry Strategy Lead, Built Environment at Microsoft. So Kwam, if you, good afternoon, hopefully you're well. And if you wouldn't mind just giving a short introduction to the audience viewers about yourself and what they'd be expecting from you today, that would be great.
I will do. Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon to all the folks on the webinar as we speak. As Peter mentioned, Kwame Adewale, I'm the industry lead for our built environment team here at Microsoft UK. So I lead our go-to-market strategy and presence for all our enterprise clients who design, build, operate, and maintain infrastructure assets across our UK companies. So lovely to be here, and thank you to IWFM for having us this afternoon.
No, thank you, Kwam, and thank you as always. And you've demonstrated how this should be done. So thank you on the introduction. So just moving along, a gentleman from our technology special interest group, Derek Lawrence, owner of Twindle. So hello, Derek, and good afternoon to yourself.
Hi, Peter. Hi, everyone. So my name's Derek. I'm a chartered building services engineer by training, but more recently, and with my formation of the company I own and operate now, and as Twindle, I'm more involved in helping clients unpick this digital twin in terms of its practical application. Where do you start? So that's I'm got an increasing expertise in reality capture, laser scanning, some people call it, but there are many means of that, but also the implementation of data, overlaying data on those captures and how that can be done. So that's where I'll fill in the gaps in airtime today, I guess.
No, thank you, Derek. And moving along, Paul McCarthy, Chief Technology Officer at ServiceWorks Global. So good afternoon to yourself, Paul.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Peter. So I look after the software development teams at ServiceWorks Global, and I've been taking a particular interest in digital twins, smart buildings, and IoT technology driving benefits for our FM customer base. Predominantly, I'm a software techie. Really, is my background.
No, thank you, Paul. And last but not least, we've got Mike Packham, Chart Facilities Management Surveyor, BWA Europe Limited, and Mike's going to be the host today. So, Mike, you know how it should be done on the introductions now.
You're spoiling me, Peter. Or giving me too much of a big up, I think, here. Mike Packham. For my sins, I'm the vice chair of the TechSig within IWFM, and I've been asked to, somewhat confusingly, wear two hats today: vice chair of the SIG and also to chair the session today. In my real life, when I'm not in the twilight zone of digital twins and BIM and so forth, I'm an FM consultant. So I'm really interested, not so much in the technology side of things, but in terms of the information that the technology can generate for use in terms of improving the working environment for people.
Thank you, Mike. And I will go back to Mike shortly as he's hosting proceedings. So you've got to know who's on today's webinar. That's your stellar panel lineup that's going to take you through the next 50 minutes or so around the topic of part 2 on this digital twin series. But before I quickly hand back to Mike, there's just a couple of remind people where obviously we've got Qualm today from Microsoft and some of the collateral that's already out there for members, non-members to have a read and look at how we've evolved the conversation over the last couple of years. These are fairly recent documents, particularly one on your left there, the Smart Places Ecosystem Forum, which this digital twin series has been based on. So there's a lot of good leading thoughts there from thought leaders around the topic of ecosystems and digital twins, and something we did with Microsoft 2 years ago about the importance of the power of digital partnership. So QR codes are available, slides will be made available afterwards as well. So also a reminder, I have alluded to this numerous times already. This is a series. Our third part will be on the 30th of September. That'll be reminded later in today's episode. But the first episode, which really was focusing with Qualm's colleague Tom Brooks, as well as Gordon Mitchell, our chair of our technology special interest group and Key FM, around actually the what, how, why about digital twins, and it's very much more presentation led more than today's episode. So that was just a bit of a look back on the collateral and the first part, but keen to get into the second part as soon as possible, and enough from me. At this point, I would like to remind people to send questions through if they can, and we have got a dedicated Q&A session on today's webinar. But that's enough from me. I can see Mike there in my top right hand corner, so I'll hand over to Mike, host and the panel, to take you through today's webinar, and I will be back later to close proceedings. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Well, we thought probably rather than just plough straight into things, we would do a bit of a quick recap, set the scene as it were, over as to the proceedings from webinar 1. And those of you that have actually were present for webinar 1 or have seen the recording since will be familiar with this graphic, I'm sure. So what is a digital twin? I think that let's start from the very beginning. Is it a BIM model? Is it a smart building? Is it about whole life? What is it? Well, this graphic here just tries to encapsulate what we mean by a digital twin. It's a BIM model plus lots of other bits and pieces. It's about real-time data. And why do we need real-time data? Well, I think we need to understand that our organizations operate in a dynamic environment. They're constantly changing, and therefore the data that we need needs to constantly change with us. It's about interactive layering, building in business processes, integrating all of those so that we get into a system modeling type approach. Whole life data, yeah, absolutely. As we go through time, we build up a database of information, then that enables us to better understand the buildings that we're in, the way that people use our buildings. And of course, that leads into the item we've got at the bottom here, the mathematical models, AI processes and simulations. So a digital twin for us is all about something which comprises not just FM, it's about the organization, and it's about the impact of that organization on society at large. Now, I think just quickly before I move on to the next slide here, which again is taken from webinar 1, there was a quote I saw on LinkedIn very, very recently from David Sharp, and I will read it out. It said, technology can and should play a part in creating a better world, but we need to be smart. That means starting with the humans and not the data. And I think there is a message there about where we need to be coming from with digital twins. It's not about collecting lots and lots of data and doing clever things with it. It's about understanding what our organizations need from us as facilities managers to deliver to them if they are going to be productive in the workplace and they are going to enjoy coming to the workplace. So with those words of wisdom from David Sharp, could we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, as I said, again, this is taken from webinar 1, where we looked at how FM can move towards digital maturity to drive good outcomes. That's in terms of environmental, social, financially, governance, and so on. Effectively, what we're talking about there is the ESG agenda. which is gaining a lot of publicity out there in the marketplace at the moment. We also looked at the ethics and principles that help to guide us in facilities management to ensure that we are delivering best practice and value to our organizations. And what we've got on the screen here are the Gemini principles, which were published by the Centre for Digital Built Britain. I had to read that off because I can never remember that bit. They undertook a 5-year research project, and these were the principles that they came up with. Now they've actually closed down. They've come to the end of their 5 years, so they passed these principles over to us in the industry to bring to reality and to build into our digital transformation. So can we move on to the next slide, please? And this is where we get you guys to do some work. There's a poll here. What we'd like you to do is to just, if we can put the poll up, does the poll come up on the screen? Yep, there it is. Very simple poll for this first one. How far, or have you decided to embark on a digital twin journey? Yes or no? Quite a simple one for the first question. There's another poll coming up in a moment. I have to keep talking for 30 seconds apparently, whilst the results come up. So how are we doing with the... Okay, so we have, that's roughly a third, 2/3 people on the call haven't actually started, which again is quite interesting, I think, given there's been a lot of publicity about digital twins out there in the marketplace. But I think a part of what we're trying to do today is to give you some panelists can't vote, by the way. Why can panelists not vote? I've got a message up on my screen, so that's a bit strange. That's probably rather defeats the point. Anyway, let's move on to the next. Again, this is taken from the previous material, albeit presented in a slightly different way, and it shows the stages to the digital twin journey, starting with the emerging stage. Right at the bottom there, we're starting to realize we've got bits of information around the place. It's all fragmented and we can't do an awful lot with it. To be able to make anything meaningful out of it, we need to manipulate the data. Stage 2 is around exploring, starting to think about what we have got and what we would like to have. Stage 3, we develop that into a digital framework. Stage 4, we integrate it, we put it into practice, and then once we've done all of that, stage 5, we get into a continuous learning situation. Now, I think a lot of that is a bit like any project, really. We need to think about what it is we've got, what we want to do, how we're going to go about developing it, and then integrate it. Gordon Mitchell, when he did the first webinar, he actually called stage 2 digital mirror. Stage 3 was a digital shadow, and you don't get to digital twin until you get to stage 4. We were thinking when we were talking yesterday about this, whether we should have a stage 0 on here. Stage 0 being I don't know, or don't want to own up to where we actually got to type stage. But anyway, if we put up the next poll, let's see where those of you that are on the journey, where you think you've got to. That is assuming that the panelists can actually now vote, of course. So are we getting votes coming in? Lucy, tell me, somebody speak to me.
Hi, yep, the votes are coming through.
Okay, great. So we seem to have cured that problem.
As quick as Eurovision, is it, Mike?
Yeah, the votes from Lithuania. Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why we're doing this is because it's going to help the panelists when we get into the questions in a little while to frame their responses, if we can understand a little bit better about the level of maturity, if I can put it that way, as to where people are on their digital twin journey. There's no shame if you're unsure. If you want to tick the unsure button, that's fine. We are not going to name and shame anybody. It's all anonymous. So really, if here we go. Okay, so there are a lot of people who are unsure. That's a third of people. 10% emerging. A third again. Quite okay. Stage 2 are exploring, and then 5% of you are in the continuous learning. So, okay, so we've got a mixed spread there from our audience by the sound of it. So hopefully that's been useful for the panelists in terms of understanding how you're going to cover all of those different levels in your responses will be quite interesting, I think. So let's move on then, and let's get into the meat of the session. First topic we've got here, the potential for facilities management. I put my teeth back in, I can actually say it. How are digital twins relevant for the FM profession? And if I do it, let's do this alphabetically, which means it's Derek first, doesn't it?
Okay, yes, that's fine. So how are they relevant to digital FM profession? I mean, for me, this does ultimately go back to how we make decisions about the world we live in. The world, we're talking about buildings and FM here, but it's bigger than that. So we make decisions all the time based on data we're getting from our senses. So what we should be talking about with regards to FM and operations is we should be getting that data back from our buildings so we can make better decisions about what we do with those. And that might be a decision about something as simple as, does that room need cleaning? But it equally could be a decision about what power generation combination should we be using in the systems to give us the optimum energy usage. They're equally as important. They're just data, but seeing that data, seeing that combination of being able to help those decisions, that's something that we can't do. So for me, it's how do we get the data out of the buildings and into the hands of the people that make decisions and get them to make better decisions. In the case of operations of building, that is purely the FM world that look after that. And I think, and my observation is that really there's a huge confusion about what to do first. There is so many things, and if you come to any digital twin presentations, you'll see all these ideas, and there's almost too many things that you could do to start, which may mean you don't start in the first place, which is it's an error. So I'd encourage people to start, and if they want to know where, then that we can perhaps discuss that as part of the panel. So,
okay, thank you, Derek. Paul, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, thanks. I'd carry on from Derek's point there and say that there are so many data points that you can gather, and that makes it can make it quite confusing. And me as a techie, I'm always looking at the software angle, but what I've found is that we really need to start from what is it that we're trying to improve, and in certain use cases where we think we can improve, to your example, Derek, maybe the cleaning costs. Well, what do we need to know about the building and how it's used to drive that? So what data can we get hold of, and then what can we do as a result of that data? If we can measure things accurately, then we can put in place different changes, clean less, clean more, however we need to do it. But I think sometimes there are simple use cases that, as long as you've got the knowledge from a BIM model about where stuff is, and you've got some basic information about how things are used, and some digital data flows on certain pieces of equipment, then you can actually get moving quite quickly without trying to do absolutely everything. So that would be my take on it, is trying to find real world use cases and then adapting and using the technology to fit to solve those problems. And then as you get some benefits from those things, expand it and try and do more and more things. But I think I think someone said a bit earlier that the danger is that you try and look at everything and then don't do anything.
So do you think those case studies are out there, Paul, or is the FM industry lacking those?
There seems to be, as a relative newcomer myself, I mean, I've only been involved in this kind of sector in terms of software for a few years, and I've found probably there's loads and loads of information, and that becomes quite confusing. I think there are things that I've seen that, nicely put where, what sort of data flows can you get, what might you want to do around smart buildings, but often you need to correlate those streams of data together to actually get useful information. So your first slide, Mike, where you've got to bring that together with models and all sorts of different bits of technology. But I think it really needs to start with the facilities managers, the building owners, of trying to understand where do you want to try and make some improvements. And I don't think that's completely obvious place to start in my experience. But obviously I'm more of a software person. I'm not a facilities manager, but I think it is quite difficult for people to know where to begin the journey.
So break it down one step at a time, I think is.
Yeah, and I've seen some examples where people are looking at things like their waste management, or their energy consumption, or their the cleaning management is a good one. The maintenance of escalators. There's a lot of different use cases that are out there. But I think in a given situation, a given customer, they're going to have particular needs. So a bunch of stations, for example, might be looking more at how their escalators and lifts are being used, and how we can better optimize that. Other kind of facilities and other kind of buildings might have different use cases that are important to them. But I think it's trying to find the right place to start is key.
Okay, thank you. I can see Kwam nodding his head in agreement with a lot you're saying there. So
yeah,
Kwam, your turn.
No, most certainly. And I think Paul hit the nail on the head. Often when we embark on these journeys, talking around digital twin or the utilization of data, actually it's quite simply, what are we trying to solve for? And really narrowing down to what is the problem statement, and actually the technology conversation will follow after, but where is the determination of value for our end client as an FM professional that we are trying to utilize data to either drive some form of evidence-based decision-making or some form of predictive capability to drive action and insight for our end client. And so again, it's a combination of both what Paul and Derek said. But to answer your question in terms of how digital twins relevant for the FM professional, I think they're relevant wherever we're trying to solve challenges for our customers, whether it's we're trying to drive differential experiences for occupiers to enhance their experience, whilst they're present in a building or space, whether it be monitoring the air quality levels or pollution in a particular space, or to Derek's example earlier around energy utilization and understanding how can we potentially monitor that or drive actions and insights that can help reduce that. If I'm a financial controller and looking at energy prices at the moment, there's a particular person that benefit there, right? In the short term, in helping me remediate and drive action to reduce that energy utilization. And so the benefits are both qualitative and quantitative, both from a financial perspective, but also as well as we embark in looking at some of the broader aspects, whether that be environmental sustainability or even some of the social aspects and social gains that we can gain from just understanding our space better. Those are really the broad benefits of leveraging digital twin, not just digital twin, but I'd just say digital capabilities in general. But it all starts on what is it we're trying to solve for, and what is that determination of value for our end client, and prioritizing, almost building up that roadmap view across those use cases to determine where we start and how we deliver that program of work for our end client.
Okay, so I think all three of you are saying more or less the same thing there in terms of, let's think about what our biggest areas of gain are, potential gain coming out of it, both financially and, as Kwam just said, in terms of social heat and environmental issues. I mean, all of that sounds great, but is it, how do we physically do it? That's the question I think that we need to be trying to get to. And looking at the chart there previously, a third of our audience today haven't actually started yet. So there's a lot of potential there. And I think if I were to try and sum up what you guys have been saying, there's a need for case studies. Is that appropriate, do you think? Do we need to, does IWFM need to get out there and publish some practical case studies or something like that?
I think that would certainly be a good idea. I think there's a lot of information about what data you might get from different sensors and different technologies that can provide information that a smart building solution might use. But I think it's actually trying to turn that into something that is a real world output to the people running things, as opposed to a technology statement. And then I think, as Kwame said, the technology will then fulfill the need. And I think that you can start quite simply. I don't think you have to have an all-encompassing technical solution that covers all the bases. You can do some things quite cheaply that can drive some benefits quite quickly. But I think you do need to have some bases in place. You do need to have obviously you tend to need some kind of FM system, and you probably need some kind of rudimentary BIM model, at least, that lets you know what you've got and where, and to be able to tie that into some sources of data. But then, armed with those things, I think you can start to drive at some simple use cases. And I think a list of those things and examples of what people have done around and about in the profession, I'm sure there's many different things from different sectors, I think would be really valuable. I certainly haven't been able to find anything like that myself.
I know, thinking back to the early days when we were getting involved in BIM, then we came up with some case studies, and that generated an awful lot of interest, I think. I
was going to say, Mike, I think on my observation of the challenge is the people that understand the technology will say, well, what problem are you trying to solve? But the people that you're asking that question of don't know what the technology capabilities are. So you've almost got to start from a point of there is no technology. In your business, what are your top 5 pain centers at the moment, and what tools are available to help you do that? That may be called a digital twin at some point, but in terms of starting, the level of starting, if it's a building we're talking about, let's talk about a building. So if you're talking about a building, have I got any visual representation of that building other than the actual building that I'm probably sitting in? Have I got any representation of that building in a digital format, a 2D plan? You'd hope so, but I've been to clients that are big brand clients that don't have that for their assets. So that is a straight, how we can talk about data all you like, but what you're going to hang this on that you can make decisions on, you need to be able to relate to that. So have you got floor plans? If you haven't, then there's a whole piece of case studies that can be done for that. But it then might go to something like, okay, if you've got floor plans, have you got a panoramic photo in each room? Because that, in its simplest format, is someone taking a picture and attaching it to a plan. But in terms of its value, that will tell anyone that's going to that room what it looks like, how high the ceilings are, and start dealing with some of the really annoying things that happen in FM, like sending people out and them not being able to do a job 3 times because they did need steps to get to that room. They didn't know it was those type of light fittings that were changed. That's the visual connection to the data and the decision making. That should be, in my view, where people are starting, because it's easy. Why don't you start easy? You're allowed to. You can add to it. You don't have to go to AI and machine learning straight away.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I completely agree with that, Derek. I think this thought that we need this full-fledged, all-encompassing, amazing, Unreal Engine-backed graphical model of our building is what is a digital twin. I would disagree. It's about starting with simplicity, and what happens is as you evolve and you determine and you accrue value over time, you are then able to build on that view of what your twin is. At Microsoft, we often try to actually refrain from using the term digital twin when actually having the conversation. To your point, it's how do we engage the head of property services, the head of FM? What is it that are your priorities in terms of serving your occupiers of said space first and foremost, and working through that. And I'm sure there are plenty of software folks also on a call. It's around then accruing based upon that. What does that minimal viable product look like in terms of the data source, and building up a view of what value each of those data source of points provide. And so it's less so about leading with digital twin. It's more so leading with how can we answer your question, Mr. or Mrs. Client.
I think that's quite neat because it goes back to what I was saying right at the start. It's about thinking about the organization, what the people need in the organization to be able to work productively rather than collecting data for the sake of it, isn't it? Okay, some interesting thoughts coming out there. I think one of the takeaways for me in terms of the TechSig is we start thinking about some of these use cases. Maybe we can start to produce some of those. Let's move on to the next question if we can. Okay, outputs in their application. What kind of data outputs can we expect to see, and how can they be applied to FM? I think that, Graham, you've already started talking about this to some extent. Do you want to pick up here?
Yeah, sure. So one of the, in terms of, again, building upon the previous conversation around examples, one of the things that we did actually with our own building facilities out in our Redmond campus in the US was just by purely connecting sensors and building up a view of how said space was being utilized, we were actually able to drive 46% improvement in fault detection of hard assets. So that was everything from lights or other components within floors or spaces. So again, by just simply connecting and building up a visual overlay and view of what was in said space and monitoring its performance, leveraging sensors, we were able to build up a view and actually respond to issues in almost half as quickly as the time. Then when we started going into the more predictive capabilities and monitoring sort of our energy utilization and look at our consumption against the energy grid, we were actually able to improve or reduce our energy consumption on said buildings by about 14%. So again, the reason why I mention those examples is, what is the information that some of that data is providing us? Well, it's actually helping us reduce energy utilization of our building stock, but also as well reduce sort of faults, or help us respond quicker to faults on some of the infrastructure components of our buildings. And that, again, that's just our existing building stock, and there are other customer examples that I can reference. So, in terms of, to answer your question, what kind of data outputs can you expect to see? I think it's really a combination of both data outputs that infer or allow us to make decisions that can help remediate the performance of said asset, but also as well, when we look at the operational carbon emissions attributed to that energy utilization, we start to encroach in other elements of ESG as well that drive broader value for us as a business.
Okay, thank you, Grant. Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I think I'd look at the various different data outputs in sort of 4 really kind of big buckets. So the kind of energy, utilities, electrical usage, the things around like user and people flow, so space and occupancy monitoring, how lifts and escalators and things like that are used, the safety and security type aspects, so everything from access control and intrusion and alarms and things like that. And then the kind of user and well-being area, air quality monitoring, cleanliness, those type of things. So I've tended to kind of
there for the interruption. Zoom seemed to throw everybody out, and normally it's me as the IT Neanderthal that gets thrown out of these things, but I'm pleased to say it wasn't just me. Anyway, Paul, I think you'd more or less.
Yeah, I'd more or less finished
what you were saying. So I guess it's Derek. It's your turn, sir.
Yeah. So for my part, I suppose that where I started with it, I did a lot of work on existing buildings and improving their, their performance, not just energy performance, but utilization and things like that. So one of the outputs for me was as a result of this reality capture, laser scanning, Matterport, that type of stuff. But what sort of output can you expect to see? So I'm a big fan of a visual output because for me, hanging the data on a visual output allows me to make a decision quicker. So sort of an example might be, so I remember doing some stuff, it was actually community engagement stuff where we were actually going into schools and showing kids how to use some of this application, this capture application. And they did it, they just went off and did it. We showed them how, and they went and did it themselves. And but the spin-off from that was the FMs in the school then started using that piece of STEM club evening class stuff to actually start doing simple things like tag their life safety assets and things, almost as a sort of a very shareable, very usable way of talking about what they were doing, so talking about problems. So as a kind of data output for me would be a reality capture model and an application to FM. Well, how much of the FM work we do relates to space and what we see. So that's an output that I'm a big fan of, and I think that's a springboard. Then you start saying, well, could we make that room sort of go red if it's occupied or something like that, or could we? And then you start talking about that's a question that someone that knows the technology could answer, but until you started and been down that route and started thinking about your own needs, then that would be difficult otherwise. So it's a two-way game, this.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we can move on. I mean, time's marching on here. Perhaps we can move on to the next question. Okay, we're on the final question now, guys. The sky's the limit. The most creative digitization or digital twin project you've worked on. Who should we start with? We haven't started with Paul yet, have we? So let's go to Paul first.
Okay. Hopefully you can still hear me. I'm not sure if I'm
yeah, no, you're fine.
Having a few issues there.
Well, I can hear you anyway.
Yep. Okay. So I think the most creative one that we've been working on recently with a customer in Sweden is around proactive maintenance of elevators and escalators, and we've got a customer with about 150, and through that, we're just tapping into some fairly simple use able to get from those devices. We've been able to reduce maintenance visits, car trips, downtime, and a fair amount of things as well. Our appreciation of how those lifts and escalators are actually used in that area. Can you still hear me?
Broken, yeah, but yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's my example anyway. If you were able to catch that.
Okay. Thank you, Derek.
I think mine. So you're tempted to, and I think this is what actually ruins the digital twin. When someone says, "What have you worked on?" you tend to go for the far-reaching stretches. Some crazy thing that is very difficult to understand why it was a good idea, but also even harder to try and implement and take away. So I'm going to go to the other end. So, and creative, I'm going to go down to, we had no budget and no time allowed for this. So that's be creative within that environment. So, and this was something I did at Arup, where I was at last time, where we literally said, well, what can we do on the floor we're on, or what would be useful to know? At the time, we were looking at utilization of the floor plate. and so the hardware in the building, we had a Cisco network system. Everything was connected through, and anyone that wanted to use a monitor plugged in their laptop to a hub, and so they could use their screens. So that Cisco system, from a security point of view, was saying, okay, that's a laptop we know and we recognize, and it's Derek's laptop, and he's plugged in here. And that was held within that data. So that data was already being collected by the system from a security point of view. We simply reused that data. So it was through an API, an application programming interface, which is basically just a nice way of saying, you can have a look at this, but you can't take this or change this. It's a way of talking, systems talking to each other. We use that to effectively take a 2D plan and on a web page made the colors of the desks change based on whatever the Cisco networking switch said was going on. So if someone had plugged in their computer, it said that desk's taken. If they hadn't, it left it blank. So we had a desk utilization thing that was real time rather than someone going around counting things with boards or iPads, possibly, and a more futuristic version of that. But we also had, where people were sitting as well. So we just said, oh, you type in Derek, and he said, no, Derek's sitting upstairs on floor 3 today. So that was actually quite useful. And the cost for doing that was really the time of someone that could make a web page and someone that understood an API, but very simplistic reusing. So that was pretty creative.
Okay, thanks, Derek. Before we move on to Qualm, can I just ask those of you that have submitted questions previously, when we got kicked out of the system, those questions have disappeared. So if you would like them answered, can you please type them back into the box? Apologies for that. Technology is not with us today. Having talked about technology, Qualm's going to come back on now. I'm sure Microsoft have done some really creative stuff, and certainly, having sat through some of your videos previously, I know that is indeed the case. So if you'd like to.
Yeah, it's to Derek's point, when someone says what's the most creative, you kind of go to the wackiest, right? We've worked on digital twins of manufacturing plant floors at Coca-Cola, or digital twins of American football stadiums with the Oakland Raiders Football Club, or even digital twins of theme parks that currently are what we're working on. But I think to break it down in terms of its most simple, and actually, again, it's building upon Derek's point around interoperability. That's actually one of the common challenges that we see across, irrespective of what type of infrastructure asset that we're trying to build a twin on. It's how do you actually get an existing BMS or another OEM provider who's got their lift system in there, or an existing data platform that said owner of said space has. How do we actually get those things to talk to one another? And actually, the most creative aspects, I would say, of our approach is actually what we call the digital twin definition language. So how do you actually build that ontological view of the building or asset? And essentially what we've gone about the approach of doing is actually just using open source code. When people think of Microsoft and digital twins, you'd expect us to actually bring our own software and our own proprietary tool sets. But our ambition is actually to be that digital backbone that helps owners and occupiers of space bring their own system to our data platform to drive that integration. And so, to put simply, I'd say our most creative approach to sort of our digital twin is, again, leading on the messaging from the Gemini principles right at the start. There is building a foundation from a data standpoint that drives open and interoperable capabilities. Now then, the question we often get from property owners is, then, okay, how susceptible are we to security? And how do we ensure that we don't increase the threat vector? And there are sort of parameters in place to help secure both at the edge from a sensor perspective, hybrid scenarios from a server cloud perspective, but also as well at the application layer. So I would say across, whether it's the theme parks, buildings, campus spaces that we're building digital twin, our most creative element is actually driving that open, interoperable, and secure platform, so that the owner of said twin knows that their data is their data, and that we aren't using it for any nefarious acts or agents. Right? We don't monetize your data. We understand that we just provide you with the platform and tools that enable you to build on top of that. And I guess, I don't know if we've got a question on it later, Mike, but then another question I get on the back of that is then the skills needed to support such a complex ecosystem. And I'm happy to field questions around that as well.
Okay, well, we've got couple of minutes. Do you want to carry on while you're on theme on that topic?
Yeah, sure. I think there are two aspects that I often see that are blockers to actually scale production of using, whether it's IoT or even digital twin projects. One is the discernment actually of value and understanding, okay, where does the value lie and what's the actual business justification for this task that we're embarking on. But two is actually the skills component. How do I maintain my digital asset? Once it's been built, I can get a software provider or somebody in to Derek's point, to do the scans, to do the integration, to get that model. But how do I maintain that model? How do I ensure that it's still rich, it's still relevant for the asset that I'm trying to maintain or operate on behalf of occupiers of said space? And that's where, companies like ourselves at Microsoft are encouraging things such, we have an enterprise skills initiative where we offer certifications on our platform in terms of, how to build those integrations and host that capability. But that's one thing that FM providers and property owners need to be thinking around is, how do I upskill my workforce, or do I want to outsource that capability to an organization that can help me maintain that? I think that is understated in the digital twin journey, because again, everybody gets caught up again on the technical components or even on the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. But it's in that operating model in terms of running, skills is a particularly challenging and poignant point that I'd like to emphasize to those on the call to consider early on as you're embarking on your digital twin journey.
I think you're absolutely bang on there, Kwame. And in terms of I think there is some fear of and possibly from past experience of opening up going down a route of doing anything digital within a building, where at some point then the thread has been lost by the people who actually own the asset or have responsibility for the asset, and they're completely beholden to third parties to maintain. And we've seen it with building management systems. But yeah, there's the same. I think there's a fear to do that. And I think what I would say is I'm encouraging people now to do more of this stuff themselves, because I've been through the process myself and gone, this is actually not too bad. You'll need help, but you won't need help forever. To get up to a basic level of running, then you should be considering doing these things, even like the reality capture stuff, which I'm passionate about. There's not that much to it, and you can get a good way on your own without lots of cost. So yeah, why don't you start that? And the platform's really important there, quite what you're saying.
Great.
Okay, thank you. I think we probably can move on to the last slide, which says questions from memory. Yes. Okay, I've got some questions in the box here. I'm not sure who wants to answer these. First one from Nirmal. As a client, what should my expectations or communication be from the managing agent in relation to digital twins? I think it's quite an interesting one, actually. I mean, a lot of our organizations will be in occupying space as tenants, won't they? So, what's the liability, responsibility, whatever the word is, for our landlord and our managing agent in terms of this digital twin issue that we're discussing? Who's going to lead off on that one? It looks like Kwame's nodding his head there. He's in the middle of my screen as well. So do you want to lead on, Kwame?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, but again, it goes back to the point that we were discussing right at the very start in terms of where do we start? It's what are you trying to achieve, right? What is it? What are the contractual obligations? What do you want from said managing agent? And working backwards from that, Stephen Covey, famous American psychologist, talks with begin with the end in mind. That's a famous quote of his, and it's working backwards from that. And whether it's digital twin or other technology capabilities can answer the question. I think we need to move away from the technology. It's what is it that what are your expectations of the managing agent? And then we can discuss, okay, can digital twin deliver services that can help achieve that? Is it that we need to increase footfall on said space by X percentage over the next period? Is it that we need to reduce costs of running said space by 10% due to macroeconomic pressures? And then it's okay, what use cases and how can we leverage the data to back that or infer decision making that can help us drive that change? I think that's how we deal with our stakeholders, both from a tenant perspective, but also from an owner perspective as well.
Okay, thanks, Graham. And I think that neatly takes us back to what we've been saying all along. It's what does the organisation need rather than what can the technology provide, isn't it? Okay, the next one down is from Jason. It's probably one for you, Derek. How can 3D photography play a role in creating digital twins for BIM and for FM? How can FM benefit?
And I guess by 3D photography, what's meant is photography that ultimately leads to something that's like a 3D model, rather than the old
the way
school
I'm reading
red and green lens in the cinema. So not that sort. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's incredibly important, because as much as I'm passionate about point clouds and laser scanning and stuff, it's the art. You've got to, looking at them is not everyone's cup of tea, really. People prefer to look at pictures, they can understand them, they feel comfortable with them because they've been looking at them for years. So if 3D photography creates something that's like a photorealistic copy of the world, then that's incredibly important for FMs, because actually once that's been created, and I would say create that yourself, it's not that hard, it's almost foolproof, then I guess then you're onto platforms. So how can that platform be used by FMs to tag? I always start with life safety systems. How can it tag life safety systems? And from that tag, does that tag link back to your current way of working, which might be an Excel spreadsheet somewhere on a OneDrive or other platform? But OneDrive clearly is the optimum platform, right, Colin? Another. Sorry, I see what I did there.
Not another plug there, was it, Derek?
No. So yeah, how can it link back to your current workflows, and how ultimately can we get that tag to perhaps change color when status changes and things like that? There's so much that can be done with that. And I think, although there are other parts to the digital twin, I started with the visual part of it, because what my experience was when you start doing that, it just generates more questions, and you start saying, can I do this? Can I do that? And I think, so I think that there's definitely benefit in terms of 3D photography. I think the question, you do end up talking about platforms at some point, and who owns the data, and what do we do, and is there an ongoing maintenance cost to those platforms? But that's almost a separate. That's almost a case study. That's almost a webinar saying pros and cons of these type of capture systems. But yes, in short, it is a benefit too. It will be more of a benefit. And the other thing that I'm noticing at the moment, there's a lot more content being created just from people using photography on phones, walking around, creating 3D models. So perhaps give us 5 years, then perhaps nobody will be creating 3D models. We will just being created automatically as we walk around our buildings. I don't think that's as far away as it sounds. So,
all right, thanks, Derek. We have one last. Well, it's a question. It's actually a comment, I think, from Paul Cartwright. It says, reuse cases. Could IWFM aspire to collate and publish industry-derived sector-relevant benefits? And I think the answer to that has to be yes. I think that's certainly something that IWFM, certainly the TechSig, speaking on behalf of Derek, who sits on the TechSig with me, I think, and Hazel, who's listening in the background. If we are going to derive digitization into the retrofit market, we need some commonality in data, and I don't think any of our panelists would disagree with that comment there. It's pretty much a statement. So Paul, yes, I think we absolutely agree with what you've said there. So we are into
the other thing to say. I think the only place where I've been able to get consensus that everyone agrees on in terms of common data is, in order to start, you need a space, a volume, or an area, and it has to have a name. And that's where common ground breaks. So if you haven't got a space with a name attached to it, then you should do that now, to do that today, because that's the starting point for this. But what you collect after that, really, it gets more complex, I think, but you don't have to collect it all now. You can collect it in the future too. So
okay, thanks, Derek. I think we need to wind up now. So thank you to the panelists for sharing their views. Thank you to people for putting their questions on. Any questions we haven't answered, we will follow up afterwards, but I think we've cleared most of them. So Peter, back to you.
No, and thank you to you, Mike, as hosting the last 50 minutes or so of a webinar that probably could go on for another hour. But I think the key for me, some takeaways, is this is a journey. We have got part 3 on that. We've set a challenge there from one of our questions that come in from Paul Politely, one of our members, about tangible outcomes, case studies. So no false promise here. As an institute, we will be looking into that, and really this is part of our own journey on digital twins, of providing information and guidance to our members, non-members, around the topic of digital twins. So at this point, Mike, thank you very much for hosting. Derek, Paul and Kwam for your contributions. As I say, it could have gone for another hour. Thank you very much for that. I've got a couple of closing out slides just to let the audience know. Part 3, I've already mentioned it a couple of times, is on the 30th of November. Details will be on the website shortly. So that will conclude our 3-part webinar series, but doesn't conclude the Institute's view on digital twins, as I've already mentioned. So please look out for that shortly. CPD number there, it's on your screens there. Obviously the recording will be made available, but please take note of that number for your CPD records. As of today, we've launched our sustainability survey on well-being. Again, we will have our QR codes on our webinars, so there's another QR code just in case you were missing them. But that closes on the 18th of November, so we'd encourage our viewers, listeners, to complete that survey. It is a value piece of research, research that we've been conducting for the last 15 years around sustainability. So very, very important for FM and workplace professionals going forward. Again, just to demonstrate, we've got a number of our volunteers on the panel today from our technology SIG, but this is our world of volunteers and community and other events that are taking place right up and down the country with hybrid, either online or in person. These are all on the events pages, but there's a long list there just to show the activity going on up and down the country for our members to join. And once again, I just want to say a massive thank you to Mike, Derek, Paul and Kwam to take us through our second part of this Digital Twin series. And lastly, the viewers, listeners, for joining us for the hour. As I say, this is recorded. The recording will be on the website shortly, along with the slides. Please look out for the details for the 3rd in the series. And at this point, there is a survey. It's a very short survey, not just to rate today's episode, but future content you would like to see, particularly around technology, digital twins. Please let us know. That survey will be shortly sent to you after this webinar closes. So please complete. It does feed into our content agenda for our webinars. But that's probably enough from me. Just a massive thank you again, and hope to see you on our next episode. So take care, everyone. Thank you again.